Welcome to Sargent and Paris, a lecture by Thomas Germano. The Atelier at Flowerfield is a non-for-profit organization focused on art and community, offering both classes, lectures, and exhibitions. With that being said, here's Thomas Germano with Sargent and Paris.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you about a current exhibition now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art through this summer. So we'll get right into the images. You're looking at 3 paintings by Sargent on your screen, and we'll take a closer look at each one, with really the Madame X in the center being the highlight in the current exhibition. So a little biographical background on Sargent. He was born in Florence, Italy. He is an American artist and should be discussed as an American living abroad. So we have a phrase that we use, it's called an American expat or expatriate. His parents were mourning the loss of an older sibling, an infant that died very young, and the parents decided to move to Florence, Italy, where John was born. And they moved around quite a bit in Italy, in France, and around the Mediterranean world. And when John was about 18 years old, he wasn't very happy with the academy in Florence and decided the best place to study would be École des Beaux-Arts, or the School of Fine Arts in Paris. And his parents went along with that, thought, okay, well, nothing but the best for their son. They were quite well off. The father was a doctor who was not working in the medical field in Europe, and his mother was a formidable watercolorist who encouraged young John to draw every day. The first half of his life was spent in Paris, where he really came of age in the dozen years that we'll be taking a look at. In yellow on your screen, those are the years that we'll be focusing on tonight. So it's really the beginning of his formative years, 1874, arriving at the very same time that the first Impressionist exhibition was held in Paris. And he's really between two worlds, the academic world of the official salon and the new artists who are doing what's called Impressionism today. The second half of his life was spent in London, which I'll touch upon just at the very end of today, because that's really another topic for another lecture. But he will come to be known as a painter of England, but he got a reputation in America and will be on both sides of the Atlantic, eventually really getting some pretty high prices for his full-length portraits, the equivalent of what would be about $120,000 to $130,000 by today's currency exchanges. So quick biographical description, and then his academic training. So as I already mentioned, he studied first at the Accademia, which is where you'll see the Michelangelo David sculpture today. He then moves to Paris and gets his formal studies done with École des Beaux-Arts, and then enters into the studio of Charles-Auguste Émile Durand, who will refer to tonight as Carolus Durand. Carolus Durand was not that much older than many of his students, and he's a guy who was very sympathetic to the new style of what comes to be called Impressionism in the next years. Born in Lille, he died in Paris in 1917, so really corresponds directly with what Sargent was doing in Paris, and it's through Carolus Durand that the education of Sargent really solidified. And the two, because they were close in age, were also closely connected as friends, as well as a student-teacher relationship. You're looking at 3 images of Carolus Durand. On the left is the photograph. The portrait, now in the Clark Institute, not in the Met show, but referenced in the catalog and also on one of the title sheets. And on the far right, a pen and ink drawing by John Singer Sargent of his good friend and mentor, Carolus Durand. The early years were spent doing what artists should be doing, drawing from the ancient classical examples, classical figures with contrapposto, light and shadow, and a good sense of anatomical accuracy. This is the Dancing Faun after the antique. Light and shade, also charcoal on paper from 1874 to 77. And this work, which is a model standing before a stove. While in the studio of Carolus Duran, the students really ran the studio, and the master came in twice a week for a visit to check up on the students, see what they were doing, give them some feedback. But the students hired the models, they worked from the models, and they were quite close in a similar room where they were working from the live model. That's where this piece fits in quite early on. The artist is 19 years old when he did this work. Going to Lille, the birthplace of Carolus Duran, Carolus Duran introduced his students to this beautiful bust, the bust at Lille, and painted by John Singer Sargent. He was just 21 years old. It suggested that this piece might be a work that was originally sculpted by Leonardo da Vinci, or it could have been by Raphael. It seems unlikely that it was by Leonardo, and more likely that it was done by one of the artists that was in the circle of Raphael in later years. I'm going to ask everyone to just mute your microphone. There's a little bit of background noise, so perhaps you can just turn off the mic so that nobody else is listening to the background noise where you are. There's a lot of conversation.
Totally the same. Totally the same, you guys. It's so
Okay.
ridiculous. Anyway, which is very worrying because people were not being treated well. I was not able to say goodbye to people.
Okay, Thomas, you can continue.
I think maybe if you didn't hear what I just said in the last one, I think I might have been muted. So head of a model from the studio of Carolus Duran, the same model which John Singer Sargent would work from. You'll recognize the mustachioed young fellow. In this case, Sargent adds a little bit of a classical element to this figure, giving a laurel wreath to the headdress of the model, and a third time, which will start to make some comparisons to another American expatriate living and working in Paris and then London. And in fact, it's an artist who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Whistler was onto something dealing with the tonal values of a painting, like how a musician might think about the notes in a scale. So if a musician is limited in the number of notes that he can play to stay within a key, James Abbott McNeill Whistler was limiting his tonal value to just represent subtle notes that plays white against white against white. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as the culmination of these investigations really comes about with the sensing of the veil, and more about that in a moment. But these subtle whites against the pedestal and against the wall and against the plate start to engage in some of the issues that Whistler was on about in the 1860s. And being a fan of this other American expatriate, Sargent will experiment with that subtle tonal range that limits the palette, limits the range of colors, but also relates the work to musical notation, as we'll see a little bit later. So this is a young man in reverie, 3 examples of the same model. Working out some of the formal issues of light and shadow. This is not an easy thing to do, to have a canopy over a table with light trickling in on the top of the table and on the floor, and then looking through the lattice work into the light-infested courtyard and the brighter sky beyond. It's called the wine glasses, and there are 2 glasses of wine in the foreground on a tray, on a ledge in front of a light-filled floor, cast in shadow by the table, but a little bit of the tablecloth on the far right in light, as Sargent is working out the issues of light and shadow. And having just been exposed to the first Impressionist exhibition the year before, I think you'll see some Impressionist brushstroke with the loose handling of the paint. This painting was eventually gifted to his friend and teacher, Carolus Duran, as a token of appreciation for the learning that he received from Carolus Duran, whose portrait we see here and whose inscription you can read on the top, signed by John Singer Sargent, but inscribed to Carolus Duran. The left is a sketch of the finished portrait on the right, which you can see is quite developed. And there's a painterly aspect that John Singer Sargent preserves in the otherwise pretty realistic and very formally worked out portrait, a skill that Carolus Duran had certainly taught his students, and Sargent chose wisely in selecting the painter, Carolus Duran, as his personal mentor and teacher at this time. Carolus Duran recognized a great talent in his midst and would ask John Singer Sargent and another student from that studio to assist him in a major commission that he had received a couple of years earlier, but only started in 1878, as there was a few years lapse between receiving the commission and when he actually started painting it. This painting of the Triumph of Maria de' Medici represents the Florentine-born woman of the Medici household that married King Henry V, the King of France. And the Luxembourg Palace, which is where you'll see this painting today, was the preferred residence of Maria de' Medici. She didn't like the cold, inhospitable quality of the Louvre, and she chose to live what is now the left bank over across the Seine in the region where you'll find the Luxembourg Palace today, which I've seen a few art exhibitions, a wonderful Cézanne show a few years ago. You can visit that place and we'll see that John Singer Sargent became quite familiar with the Luxembourg Palace and the gardens outside. So asked by Carolus Duran to accompany him in painting this major commission, you'll see the entirety of the painting on the right, and then underneath that temple, a classical temple, the detail on the left reveals a couple of really interesting personalities within the painting. Both Beckwith, the student who was in the studio along with Sargent of Carolus Duran, and Sargent appear in this painting. And they each represented their mentor, Carolus Duran. In fact, the fellow with the mustache and dark hair on the far right is a portrait of Carolus Duran. Sargent is the mustache and bearded character in the top center, and the figure with the cross on the upper left, you'll recognize as Beckwith. Also a very important artist for his time, but he never quite achieved what Sargent and Carolus Duran did in theirs. So that would be really a token of respect and confidence in the skills of Sargent, who not only mastered the skills of the formal issues of painting, but also was trusted with accompanying Carolus Duran in one of his most important state commissions, the Luxembourg Palace painting of the Triumph of Maria de' Medici. Sargent, depicted here in the photograph in the center in his Paris studio, has one of his most famous paintings behind him, something that he had until about 1916 as it was unsold. And he brought that painting from Paris to his next studio in London, and it's not until about 1916 that the painting eventually gets sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it's seen today in their permanent collection. So from the student days to 1884, the infamous and scandalous Madame X painting, those are the 10 years between his arrival in Paris and his great triumph with the infamous Madame X, something that caused quite the scandal, and we'll chart those 10 years today and a couple of years after this painting before Sargent decided to eventually leave and settle in London. On the easel in that black and white photograph, which you'll see in the entry room to the exhibition, just in black and white, not only is there the infamous Madame X, which I've blown up on the left side of your screen, but on the easel is the breakfast table. Not in the current show, but I've included that one on the far right. And that's an 1884 canvas, which shows a domestic interior. There are other domestic interiors in the end of the show, but that's what Sargent was on about, dealing with interior scenes typical of what the French Impressionist realists were doing at the same time, an everyday slice of life from their own surrounding epoch. From 1879, backing up a little bit, we have two paintings that deal with the rehearsal of the Pastelou Orchestra at the Cirque d'Hiver. These are relatively monochromatic on the right, and on the left, with loud splashes of color, you see these performers in bright costume on the lower portion of the composition, but the overall arrangement of the percussionists and the stringed instruments are relatively the same in that circular theater where the orchestra is playing. Like his contemporaries in the Impressionist movement, Degas, Toulouse-Lautrec, and a number of others, Sargent was representing subjects of the everyday ordinary, looking for his ultimate personal subject, which becomes really the portrait within a few years. Sargent was an accomplished pianist in his own right and often played the piano for his sitters. When people were modeling for Sargent, he would give them a little break, play the piano for a while, and then go back to the drawing or the painting, as he was quite good as a pianist. So he certainly would have associated with these musicians and felt right at home doing these two paintings, relatively small, but the same subject of the Pastelou Orchestra in the Cirque d'Hiver. Back to the Luxembourg Gardens, where he was working with his teacher, Carolus Duran. This is in the Luxembourg Gardens, 1879, and you can see that, like the Impressionists, he's interested in the effects of light on color. So dealing with broad brushstrokes, like the Impressionists, and a subject matter that's everyday, ordinary slices of life, a fashionable dressed Parisian couple strolling through the grounds of the Luxembourg Palace. When you look closer at some of the details, those splashes of bright red behind the man sitting on the bench, far left, and that purple lavender color coming over the urns representing some of the flower, these are very broad brushstrokes like Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and Degas, as Sargent was embracing the new style that was just introduced in Paris at the time, still not quite accepted, but Sargent recognized a good thing when he saw it. And he applies that to this Impressionist-inspired work in the Luxembourg Gardens, a landscape which we'll see him engaging with more in his early career, abandoning that for portraits of bust length and full figures later in his career. While living in Paris, Sargent traveled during the summer months when formal studies did not meet, and upon completing his formal art training in Paris, Sargent traveled further and for longer periods of time. He applied for a copyist's permit, reproducing masterpieces in the Prado, one of which we'll see in a moment, the famous Las Meninas. So he traveled to places such as Italy, France, Spain, Holland, Northern Africa, and Morocco, and even America, making his first transatlantic trip at the age of 20 to the Boston area where his family were from, but he had never been there. So making that trip and documenting it in a scrapbook as well as studies in oil paint. From Capri, we have the Staircase of 1878, a beautiful, very abstract image, but clearly light and the effects of light coming down the center of that narrow passage in southern Italy. Capri, by the way, is the island off the coast of Naples, where he also painted this work, and you'll recognize the same model dancing on the rooftop here. It's called Capri Girl on a Rooftop, now in the Crystal Bridges Museum, and she's dancing to an accompaniment of a tambourine tapper, as that's keeping the rhythm as she's dancing on the rooftop, overlooking the setting sun and the mountains in the background. The same model with the same dress, pink dress and green vest with a white undershirt, seen in the profile here, will have a name. And this is among the olive trees, also in Capri. But the name of this model is Rosina Ferrara, somebody that Sargent was looking for. He put the word out that he was looking for a certain type, somebody who has a Greco-Roman classical quality, dark olive skin. And this was the model that was presented to him. And he took a liking and made some beautiful works from Rosina. The last two and this work, a profile of her head painted with oil on canvas. So that's Rosina, and a Capri peasant study, the perfect model for what he was searching for at that time. On the mainland of Italy, we have Naples, and Naples is surrounded on the west coast by the Mediterranean Sea, as we'll see these young children, 4 on the sand, 1 additional figure just to the right of center, head bobbing above the water, and the 6th anthropomorphic form is the sailboat over the head of the child on the far left. These 4 children are all naked. It's quite customary to see children without bathing suits because they change sizes so quickly. Naples was always a rather impoverished part of Italy, so parents didn't buy a new bathing suit, the new style, as some children might have today. But here we find 4 nude children. Sargent represents the passage of light and shadow on the figurative study. And if you're wondering about the back of that central standing figure, well, those are flotation devices, likely to be inflated pig bladders that keeps the boy afloat, as he's not quite of the age to know how to swim, and so as not to drown. His parents have fastened these pig bladders to his back to keep him above water. We don't know if the other figure on the far left has them, but he's younger and certainly could use them if he's going into the water. But these are Neapolitan children bathing, now in the Clark Institute, which has a wonderful collection of works by John Singer Sargent, especially from this early period. That transatlantic trip that took place in 1876 to 78 occurred when Sargent was just 20 years old, and crossing the Atlantic to visit relatives for the very first time, he documented the entire process. Painting on the boat, this is a oil painting on canvas, and this more treacherous depiction of the sea, which seems to threaten to overtake the boat as the waves are getting quite high, and those dirigibles on the left and on the right, lifeboats, are at the ready to save anyone who needs to go overboard. So this is the Atlantic storm from 1876. Again, the 20-year-old Sargent is documenting this cross-Atlantic trip and also keeping a scrapbook of prints, drawings, watercolors, and photos in a scrapbook. You can see the 2 pages side by side in the current exhibition, and they include cutouts of the water, the boats, and some of the figures who work on the boats in these various drawings. And that would be a good way of working, as Sargent eventually will draw from that in his later works, in other works that deal with the sea and watercolors of boats on the water. The first major work that's attributed to John Singer Sargent is fishing for oysters at Cancale. Cancale is in the northwest of France, and spending a summer there, he started out, as he always does, with drawings first, as you'll see a pencil drawing on the right, and then oil sketches of the same figure in a slightly different pose, but the same left hand is on the hip in both the drawing and in the sketch. Working out some of the sketches for the women who are accompanying the children in these paintings. This is Girl on the Beach. And these are studies for his first major painting that has multi-figures set within a landscape on the shoreline of Cancale, which was quite an undertaking for a young artist of just 22 years old. This is now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., but as I mentioned, nothing of this caliber was attributed to Sargent, not including the masterpiece of his teacher, Carolus Duran. That was not his design, but this is entirely start to finish by Sargent, and something that required quite a bit of work on location, and then bringing those studies back to his studio where he much preferred to work, having a little bit too much of an audience, which was not conducive to his working style. He preferred a little bit more privacy, but he did attract quite a crowd while he was on the beach, as people were curious. Traveling to Venice, the country where he was born, Italy, not far from Florence, his birthplace, This is the Cafe on the Riva degli Schiavone, and it's a watercolor on paper. It's not your typical tourist scene of Venice, but rather it's like the French Impressionists showing cafe life, sitting on the streets, sitting in restaurants, and you'll see those silhouetted figures on the bottom right who are the main focus of the composition. But if you look careful, and if you know Venice, as I've been there quite a few times, you'll recognize the building on the far right is the Doge's Palace. Behind that is the Sansovino Library with the classical arches. And across the Grand Canal on the left is the Church of Santa Maria della Salute, the Longina building in the Baroque style. And that's just in front of what later will become the Peggy Guggenheim Museum, to give you a sense of orientation. Another work from probably very close to the previous, but elevated a little bit higher. I suspect that this was done in a second or third story hotel room looking out upon the Grand Canal on the left. Now we can see the bell tower, the Campanile, which rises up on the upper right, in back of the Doge's Palace, which has that salmon color on the left facade facing the Grand Canal, and then the walkway that has a number of pedestrians. And it's very similar to what we see in artists like Camille Pissarro, who was included in the first Impressionist exhibition in 1884. Again, that same church, della Salute, is across the Grand Canal in the mist and in the atmosphere in this 1882 work that Sargent did still quite young in his mid to late 20s. Again, in Venice, we have this work of Raymond Supercassou in a gondola, and he was a minor watercolorist artist who's on the opposite side of the boat from John Singer Sargent, who's doing his portrait as Raymond is doing a drawing of John Singer Sargent. Both on one of the side canals of Venice. You can see a beautiful description in that very painterly application of light on the surface of one of those side canals. But what really makes this painting extraordinary is the way that John Singer Sargent captures the light coming through that canopy that covers that gondola, which is likely to be on a hot day. So there's a cover overhead, but the light comes through the sheer material of orange and white stripes just behind the head of Raymond Supercassou. Supercassou was the Chilean diplomat, consul, if you will, in Paris. He befriended John Singer Sargent, and the two men would go traveling. We'll see that Sargent also does the wife, Amalia, of Raymond Supercassou. But these are some of the inner circle of Sargent, as he oftentimes would make art from his friends, fellow artists, and associates in the widening circle that he engaged in Paris during his time there. This is 1880, Raymond Supercassou in a gondola. Also in Venice, you would not know that if you didn't look very carefully beyond that center lit area outside the balcony, and you're looking into one of the canals. But otherwise, we're in the interior with John Singer Sargent in the light, looking into a relatively shaded room with the light from the back also reflected off the surface of the floor and the light coming across diagonally. But Sargent is in the light, and the two women coming across the room in our direction are casting a long shadow to a third figure seated against a wall, and a few more figures are seen in the background, creating a wonderful sense of spatial depth from the foreground to the background. A Venetian interior. This is a young woman with a black skirt, a watercolor, and two street scenes. Only the work on the left is in the current show at the Met. The work on the right you'll have to see at the Clark Institute, and both are very similar. There's a rather curious conversation between a man and a woman, and we're left to invent our own narrative. What are they talking about? What sort of an exchange is going on? So there's that pregnant possibility of what's being discussed, and perhaps one of those answers might be found in the next painting, which is called The Sulphur Match, where the two, similar to the two in the alley of a closer claustrophobic space, those tight streets of Venice that wind in a labyrinthine manner, here you can see a couple, a man and a woman, smoking, and there's an empty bottle of wine on the floor in one of those wicker surroundings, and the woman is leaning back in a playful manner, signed on the upper right, and the location, Venice, is indicated with the date following of 1882. Again, it's called the sulfur match. The idea that I discussed earlier about the white on white really comes into full clarity with this masterpiece, one of two versions that John Singer Sargent did. This is the larger of the two from the Clark Art Institute. There's a smaller version, which is similar in design, but this is significantly larger in scale. So the idea of white on white on white comes from James Abbott McNeill Whistler, whose three works I'm showing you on the screen currently. And this was a radical invention that dates back to 1863. And Whistler had made quite a splash in the infamous Salon of Refused Artists. And Sargent, being a fellow American expatriate, knew about the works of his not only fellow American, but also fellow New Englander, and eventually will have quite a bit in common in experimenting with that white on white, giving his paintings very musically inclined titles. We have Symphony in White #1 on the far left, Symphony in White in the center. Same model, by the way, Joe Heffernan, the beautiful red-haired Irish model who appears in a number of paintings by Courbet. And this is the model that Whistler had to hide from his mother when she came unannounced and stayed at his flat on Tite Street for an extended visit. And then on the far right from the Frick collection, we have a Mrs. Leyland. She's the wife of the shipping multi-millionaire who had commissioned Whistler to do the famous peacock room in his home. So three works that have very, very subtle white areas. We'll come back to this work, and this makes more sense in responding to what Whistler had done in his work. Sargent is attempting that and really comes into his own in this beautiful smoke of ambergris. She's incensing her veil so that the incense stays on her body for the remainder of the day, coming out of that incense burner on the floor. We're in some form of a Moroccan mosque. There's no figurative artwork. There are carpets on the floor and tiles in front of that, but there's a very minimalist interior, as mosques and Islamic design forbids any animals or human representations on the interior of those structures. So we see this beautiful stucco work up above, and it's not the last time that we'll see some works of mosques and other architectural inventions by the great Sargent. But Fumée d'Ambergris, or smoke of ambergris, is sensing the veil and putting on a little bit of perfume in a smoke manner. Also a white on white, we see the Parisian beggar girl. This is something that has white on the veil against a white wall behind her, a white dress, only interrupted with that belt of a very sharp contrast of the black and the red that comes around the elbow on the outstretched hand, begging for money on the street. The Alhambra is in Andalusia, again, another one of the travel sites that Sargent went to, and certainly inspired by one of the greatest novels of the 19th century, also written by an American who traveled abroad, Washington Irving, who wrote the famous Tales of the Alhambra. And that would attract a lot of interest to this former palace of the last Muslim ruler in the south of Spain. That whole southern tier of Spain is called Andalusia, and this is in the city of Granada. Granada and Cordoba, Sevilla, and that whole stretch across the southern part were settled by Northern African Islamic individuals in the early Middle Ages, and they would bring a lot of the culture, the religion, and the design sensibility into southern Spain. The difference is the way that they invent scallop-shaped arches, and I'll point that out next. But this is the Court of Myrtles, which has a very aromatic scent in it, myrtles, and there's a reflective pool down below. That's in keeping with the rule not to represent humans or animals. So to paint life and man-made architecture, it's done in the reflection on the surface of that shallow pool. Reflective pools that are quite common features in many Islamic architectural designs. This is a Moorish building in sunlight, and here's a great example of that calloped arch, which pinches in down at the bottom on either side of that green door, and then it's pointed, as all Islamic arches are pointed, to displace the weight to go down to the floor and not to be hung up above, as a curved arch would be liable for collapsing. So that's where the Islamic architectural invention really excels. And the Crusaders, who came back from the Middle Ages, would bring that pointed arch and invent what's now referred to as the Gothic style. But we have the Muslim architects to thank for that innovation from the traditional Roman arch. And one more Islamic design with the callop shape. You'll see that on both sides of the Mediterranean, on the Moroccan side in northern Africa, as well as southern Spain and Andalusia, because that's where the Muslims came from, northern Africa, and then crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in the Middle Ages and settled, as well as farmed a lot of South Spain, and doing a much better job in producing agriculture, better than the Romans ever could. But the last Muslim ruler was thrown out in 1333, leaving behind these beautiful buildings and former residences, such as the Alhambra and a number of other designs that would be incorporated into future buildings of Christian subjects. This is the courtyard in Morocco, and there are two callop-shaped arches, one surrounding the red door and another one in front of the black door in the anteroom behind it. So the pinch in the corner and those stucco designs around the arch are suggested but not overstated by the very economical brushstrokes of John Singer Sargent. Also inspired by the dance that he experienced in southern Spain, in Andalusia, he did this painting, which you can currently see at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, on loan from the Hispanic Society of America in New York City, the Spanish dance. But what's missing in the Met, which I'll include today, is his great masterpiece shown in the 1882 Salon in Paris that received quite a bit of attention, as it's a beautiful painting showing a South Spanish dancer, a flamenco dancer, and the musicians playing flamenco guitar, as we can see these Spanish guitars not only in the hands of the musicians, but also hanging from the wall, and additional dancers are sizing up and getting ready on the upper right, with a percussionist clapping hands on the far left. The El Helejo is today in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, but it was shown very successfully at the 1882 Salon, and Sargent really started to come into his own. A young man of just barely 27 years old, he made quite a splash with this work, but followed up this work 2 years later with the infamous Madame X, that received even more attention by this very prolific and advanced American artist. In the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, you'll see this within a setting that's influenced by the Islamic arches, these callop-shaped arches that pinch in at the center. And that's down the long corridor in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, something that you'll see from a great distance, some 30 or 40 yards away. And this, according to many close friends, was Isabella Stewart Gardner's favorite painting in her entire museum. And that's saying a lot, because she had quite a few masterpieces by Titian, by Michelangelo, by Fra Angelico, Piero della Francesca, Degas, so many great masterpieces, as she was amassing one of the most important museums in Boston, where John Singer Sargent also painted while he was in America. The two had known each other in Venice, where she lived with her husband. After her husband's death, she lost the taste for staying alone in Europe and moved back to her native Boston, built the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum with a courtyard fashioned after one of the Grand Canal houses of Venice, and started to collect a lot of art with the help of Bernard Berenson, the Harvard University art historian, who was her art consultant and acquiring agent in Europe. There's a great book that describes the letters between Berenson and Gardner, who were busy buying up art in the late 19th century. So this is in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, her favorite work. And there's also a portrait of Isabella upstairs in that museum, painted by John Singer Sargent. Quite possibly one of the Spanish Roma or Gypsy beauties. This is the Spanish Roma woman painted by John Singer Sargent. And you'll see that loose brushstroke, something that Carolus Duran had inspired in Sargent and directed him to look at some of the great Spanish artists like Velázquez, who Edouard Manet was also looking at around the same time. But here you can see that loose, very calculated brushstroke that becomes the cloth over the right shoulder of the gypsy girl, and the application of the paint on the face is economical but perfectly placed. One of the testaments to the great painterly qualities of this impressionist-influenced portraitist, who I think was the greatest American portraitist in the history of our country. A very early work by quite young, 21-year-old John Singer Sargent. This would lead his father to write to a friend, John's really done an incredible portrait and is competing with the masters of his day. It's a portrait of a childhood friend, Fanny. Her name is Frances Sherborne, but John called her Fanny. And you'll see something in this painting that John Singer Sargent does in all of his mature works. It's the way that the figure is not static. She's moving from the right front of the chair to the left back of the chair. Her body is not static against the backrest of the chair, and the left arm comes forward while the right elbow goes back in space, creating quite a twist and a turn, which we'll see in many of his portraits, with one exception that I'll point out in a moment. But that quality that he develops here at the age of just 21 years old is something that he takes with him and applies in some of his greatest paintings, most notably the Lady Agnew of Lucknow, the Scottish beauty and masterpiece, now in the Scottish National Gallery. Copying from the masters, not only was there Diego Velázquez, but there was also Frans Hals, who slung a paintbrush filled with paint. And the work on the left is the copy by Sargent. The work on the right is the original. It's the Banquet of Officers by Frans Hals. And you'll see that he only chooses the 3 heads, well, 2.5, really. You can just see the top of the bald head in the lower portion of his copy, or receding hairline. And then you can see the figure who's dominating on the center part of Sargent's painting that comes from the upper right section with one of those banners that are used by military outfits, the militia that's charged with guarding the cities. And in this case, it's the St. George militia, a company that Frans Hals would enter in his lifetime. So Hals and Diego Velázquez were looked at by Manet. Carolus Duran advised his students to look at them as well, because these are really the painterly artists who sling a loaded brushstroke, lay down the paint thick, but from a distance, it all makes perfect sense. From up close, you see the very thick paint application, but that's what the Impressionists were trying to invent. And beginning as early as Edouard Manet's, looking at Velázquez, looking at Frans Hals and other great paintings, Sargent would be advised to do the same. And he embraces this and adapts it into his own style for portraiture. As you'll see here in the portrait of 2 close painter friends, Francois Flameng in the foreground and Paul Helou, 2 French artists who Sargent was very close with. In this case, he signs it with the back of the paintbrush on the top right, and above that, inscribes it to his dear friend Francois. As for Paul, well, he didn't get this painting, but he's the figure in the background in silhouette. He is the character, the tall, lanky Paul Helou, in a drawing. And you can see in his left hand, closest to us, as the left foot comes forward, he's got a drawing instrument as he's sizing up Sargent, and Sargent is sizing him up. So this is quite common, artists drawing artists, and with a drawing instrument in his hand, he's posing for Sargent, and Sargent is posing for him. We don't have Paul Helou's drawing of Sargent, but we can rest assured that's what he's doing, just as Raymond Subercaseaux was doing the same in the covered gondola as the artist was documenting his friend, Raymond. Another friend and distant cousin, this is Ralph Curtis on the beach at Scheveningen, which is the coastline of Holland. And there's a very casual nature in the diagonal positioning of the body that moves from the lower right up the body and torso to the head, and then continues out with a contrasting diagonal of this little shadow under the right planted elbow of Ralph Curtis. The water is suggested on the right side in a very loose, sketchy manner. We see sand dunes on the lower left, but this casual composition is well composed, albeit asymmetrical, in the way Ralph Curtis appears in this small oil sketch from the coastline of Holland. The 6 paintings in the next room represent 3 paintings of the Peyron family, Dr. Rizzo, the gynecologist, Louise with the white flower, and Raymond Subercaseaux's wife, Amelia, on the far left. And we'll take a look first at the Peyron family, Marie on the left, and Edward, the father of the 2 children, we'll see next, who's posing on the right. Sargent is not yet receiving commissions to do portraits of fellow artists. He's only 23 years old and is just finished with his formal studies, but he's looking for models who can sit for him because he wants to make a name for himself. And painting the familiar and then moving on to commissions, and those started to pile up within a few years. These would be familiar faces, fellow artists who he paints first before receiving commissions in his mature work. So on the right, we see a fellow painter. On the left, the wife of the painter, Marie Bellows, and it's springtime. There's an extended landscape with crocuses in bloom, those little lavender flower heads that appear first before spring really takes hold in the early month of March, when we see the first flowering crocuses, which he represents. There's architecture in the way back distance, top left of the composition, and there's white birch trees that create marcations that move the eye from the figure in the foreground across the zigzagging crocuses to the birch trunk, and then finally the architecture in the distance. So it's a wonderful representation of landscape, in addition to a beautiful portrait of Marie Bellows Peyron in this standing composition. The 2 children are portraits of Edward Jr. and Marie Louise, who was a pain in the neck to paint, as you can tell from this painting. She later complained so heavily, but made that be known through her body language. So this is probably the stiffest you'll ever see John Singer Sargent, because this kid couldn't sit still. She later complained about having to wear this white fluffy dress. She complained about having to sit for more than 2 minutes for an artist who was very slow in taking his time, almost 2 hours to paint her. So she was full of complaints and didn't want to be there. So he represents her in the stiffest of manner, but more in keeping with his twisting and turning and fluid poses. You'll see young Edward Jr., who's turning around, the elbow comes forward, the twisting of the hand with the pinky detached and coming over the edge of that sitting area that's covered in carpets, and his legs go back in space, but he's turning and looking towards us. as poor Marie Louise is as stiff as a board, you'd think that she's nailed to that seat. But that's because little kids don't sit still. And Diego Velázquez had learned the same lesson in his famous Las Meninas, which we'll get to in a moment. Ramon Subercasu's wife, Amelia, represented at the piano, and John Singer Sargent, I mentioned already, was an accomplished pianist. And you can see Amelia is not in the pose of a pianist. She's sitting at the piano, but the piano is a prop. It's a black and white keyed, black and white instrument, and she's also wearing black and white. There's also repetitions of the red in the flower behind her head, in front of her torso, and in that planter on the bottom right, as well as splashes of red in the carpet, which moves the viewer's eye throughout the composition. And then finally, we see the green in the vase over the piano on the top left, and the green repeated once again in the planter behind the back of Amelia. There's a lot of twisting and turning in the way that she's seated, not with her back against the backrest, but diagonal across the seat and twisting to look out of the composition in our direction. And this is more typical of what Sargent would prefer in the way that he posed his sitters in a very fluid and animated fashion. Dr. Pozzo was a leading gynecologist in women's healthcare in the 19th century, originally Italian, but living and working in Paris, and at the forefront of women's healthcare. He tended to women's health issues, and it's no surprise that Sargent represents him with this bright red, very casual nightgown against a bright red backing. He also has these eccentric Turkish slippers, which I'll show you a detail of in a moment, but the fingers posed around the strap and on the center underneath the collar are beautifully painted in a way that has a fluidity in the mark and the thickness of paint on the surface. So that's Dr. Pozzo. And it's very clear that he's not in business formal, as you'll see in the photograph on the right, but this is painted by a friend, a familiar, John Singer Sargent. And it's likely that Sargent initiated this painting rather than receiving a commission, as Dr. Pozzo was at the center of a group of well-known collectors, very affluent men who admired art, and Sargent was hoping by painting Pozzo and then exhibiting it in the 1881 Salon that this would generate paid customers to follow. So not a paid portrait. This was not done on commission, but like many of the works, done on speculation with the hopes that future works would follow. The shoe in the center top, which you'll see that Turkish design on the slipper, and the beautiful handling of the paint in the fingers that pick up some of the red of the robe hanging on to that sash around the waistline of Dr. Pozzo, and a detail of the head on the right with that beautifully painted white undergarment catching the light and then moving around his head, not unlike some of the colors that we saw in Franz Hals's Militiamen. The greatest masterpiece, most will say, you'll find in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts is this work by Sargent, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyt from 1882. And again, Sargent is quite young, just 26 years old. He's painting the daughters of an American abroad living in Paris. He's moved his family back and forth across the Atlantic a few times, along with those very, very large Chinese porcelain vases that dwarf the girls. 4 girls, 2 vases that are like sentries within the composition, and that screen bright orangey red in front of the right porcelain vase. But I want to point your attention to the mirror over the mantelpiece in the dark room, flanked by 2 additional ceramic blue vases that brings the attention to the back room, that brings our attention to the light outside in a 3rd space. So it's a very complex space from foreground, where the little girl is sitting on the rug, and her sister in red and white has her left foot forward and hands behind her back. The 2 older sisters, wearing black and white, are leaning against a vase, and one is looking straight out, upright in the center, but those two vases on either side of the mirror that catches a bright light, which is outside the space within that otherwise dark room, takes us through space and time, the time of 4 periods in small girls' lives, but also the space from the foreground to the middle ground, the dark room, to the background outside of that center room, suggested by the light reflected in the mirror. This painting, you might say, is an homage to two great artists who Sargent admired in Paris and in Madrid. In Paris, there's the Bellelli family portrait painted by Edgar Degas, and in Madrid, there's this painting on the right, painted by Diego Velázquez in 1656, the famous Las Meninas. The Las Meninas is all about this little girl in the center. By the way, this is Sargent's copy after the masterpiece that you'll have to visit in the Prado in Madrid. And Sargent, who had a copyist's permit, did a formidable job in reproducing the original by Diego Velázquez, the Baroque master, and arguably the greatest Spanish painter ever. So it's about the little girl, the Infanta, and the Infanta is being primped and pampered by her ladies in waiting on the left and on the right. Notice the colors of their dress, black and white, just like the two older sisters in the Sargent Hoyt daughters. Then you have these two fixtures. They're the court dwarfs, playmates for the Infanta, the dog, and the teacher and the spiritual guide, the nun, just over the curtsying woman in the center. In the background, between the artist's studio and the space behind, you have a man standing in the doorway, in a liminal space between this room and the staircase that leads to a room behind. Not unlike what we'll describe in the mirror, where the king and the queen are reflected in the room in front of the Infanta. So just as Sargent had done, in direct inspiration and homage to this great masterpiece, there's a room in front of, there's a room within that the artist is looking out of, and his subject is the king and the queen, knowing perfectly well that little girls don't like to sit still for very long, as he's found out with the Peleron portrait. And here, the Infanta is about to join mom and dad, the king and the queen of Spain, as she's about to step right out of the front of the painting and into our space, into the zone that the artist is currently looking at, standing in front of his canvas that we only see from behind. So this is a direct homage to Velázquez, and you can see many, many similarities, the zigzagging patterns, the complex use of space in 3 different zones, but it's a tip of the hat to Velázquez, having studied and copied Velázquez's masterpiece. This is a self-started work, not a commission, but something that he did of fellow Americans. Mr. Boyt was a painter. Mrs. Boyt was quite an eccentric, and the family became part of the circle of friends of Sargent, still quite young and in Paris at this time. And we're looking at the foyer of their apartment, not far from where you'll find the Arc de Triomphe in Paris today. So an homage to Velázquez. And there's a beautiful detail of the youngest girl with the doll in her lap, quite thick in the application of paint, as you'll see on the doll, on the girl, and on the carpet underneath her. Lady with a Rose, Charlotte Louise Burckhardt, is an homage to the portrait on the right by Carolus Duran, the teacher of Sargent. And here we can see the woman with the glove, having just removed one glove, it's on the floor in front of her, and in the process of undress and about to drop the second glove. And you might say that Charlotte Louise Burckhardt is the first work by Sargent inspired by Carolus Duran's Woman with the Glove, which received quite a bit of attention in the 1869 Salon. And then he received another dose of inspiration in the Madame X, a woman in the state of undress, inspired once again by Carolus Duran. And we'll see that in just a moment. Sargent's circle included a lot of artists and creative types, and that would include the writer, Vernon Lee, which was a nom de plume for a young woman whose birth name was Violet, and choosing something that sounded a lot more masculine because in the 19th century, women were just simply overlooked and not taken seriously as authors. She chose to publish under the name Vernon Lee, and Sargent befriended her, was one of the fellow creatives in his circle, and he also did two portraits of Vernon Lee's partner, as Vernon Lee was also lesbian. Albert de Belleroche is a Welsh painter and author whose portrait you see on the left and whose silhouette drawing you'll see on the right. And you'll see a little bit of a similarity in Albert's profile to the Madame X, which we'll be getting to in just a moment. The literary circle of Sargent included the portrait of Madame Alouard Jaune, Emma Cadio, who published in the French newspaper and was the first to talk about Sargent's project of painting the Madame X portrait of Virginie Amélie Gautreau. And we'll see that in just a moment. This woman was a pioneer collector and champion of modernism. Not only did she receive this beautiful portrait of her in 1884, but she later went on to collect some of the early works of Pablo Picasso in Paris in the beginning years of the 20th century and commissioned Le Corbusier, the architect, modernist, to design a house for her, which she lived in France for much of her adult life. There's the wife of a man that Sargent was in a men's club with, and this was done by Sargent. You'll notice that there's something very similar to the gynecologist, Dr. Pozzo's portrait, but he tones down the background so that the woman with her pale flesh and the bright red dress doesn't get lost with the bright red background. It's toned down, but it again repeats the red on red, which we saw in the Pozzo portrait that was exhibited to much success, but also criticized for the redundancy of red on red. But remember, that's something that interested Whistler and Sargent alike. So this hung in a men's club with the anticipation that it would lead to future commissions once affluent men saw the portrait of his good friend's wife. He was hoping to do paid commissions, and that eventually will come to Sargent. This would be one of the paid commissions, Mrs. Henry White, now in the National Gallery. And this work, which was quite successful in the 1882 Salon, which led one critic to go back to this painting in 1884 and say, in response to the Madame X, he wasn't a fan of the Madame X painting and referred back to the Madame Paul Escudier portrait, calling it something done by Sargent when he knew how to paint. And talk about cheeky, underhanded compliments. The critic liked this work, but thought the Madame X was a little bit too harsh and crude, but the entire art world was critical of both painter and model for reasons we'll learn in a moment. A precursor done at the same time as the Madame X, but exhibited before Madame X. You'll see a right shoulder strap, not attached as the left one is. This is the mother of a friend of John Singer Sargent, and the infamous Madame X, which caused the greatest scandal in the 1884 Salon in Paris for a number of reasons we'll get into now. The painting, which really carries from a great distance, as you can see here, is of the American-born beauty, Virginie Amélie Gautreau. And here she is standing with the photographer on the left and on the center, and painted by Sargent, choosing a profile, a side profile of Madame Gautreau with just one prop, a table, and simplifying the background with brown, as Diego Velázquez did with so many of his standing portraits. So known as an American beauty, she and her mother had left New Orleans, French territory that had been defeated, as all of the South was during the American Civil War. She moved back to France where her mother had roots, and she was one of the most exotic beauties, capturing the attention of many French men. She would also capture the attention of quite a few artists, and Sargent, like several before and after him, would request her to sit for their portraits. This is Sargent's most famous portrait, but these are three additional works. Nader, the photographer, on the left, Gustave Courtois in the center, and Antonio de la Gandara on the right, all representing the same American-born beauty, who was considered one of the most exotic, beautiful women in Paris of her day. Sargent requested that she sit for him, and the two would develop a simpatico relationship, both American by nationality, and both able to speak fluent French as well as English. So they really had quite a friendship. Some suggested that there was more than just artist and model, but that's ridiculous. It's quite likely that John Singer Sargent was homosexual, and it was a fact that Madame Gertrude was married happily at the time, soon to be divorced, but she was faithful to the husband and certainly not engaged in any foul play with the artist, who was looking at the model as a source of inspiration and beauty. He drew a number of pencil drawings, capturing her first with a friend, then from behind, then seated on a sofa, and a couple of different poses, thinking maybe she should be reading, scratching that idea, and settling upon the stark profile, which we'll see the right and the left in these two drawings, and choosing the best profile, the right side. This was not included in the exhibition, but you'll have to see it at the Harvard Museum, Fogg Museum. It's a seated side view of Madame Gertrude, but clearly not the final version that John Singer Sargent settled on. Side views that show off her greatest attributes, which is the angularity of her nose, lips, and chin. And that's what Sargent discovered was her source of great exotic beauty. So the painting in the center is what it looks like today, but you'll notice a difference in the left, a photograph from the 19th century, and a photogravure, also from the 19th century, on the far right. The shoulder strap was fixed after the exhibition because that created such a scandal. People referred to Madame X as in the state of undress, taking off her very low-cut dress for the artist and assuming that something was to follow, some scandalous play between artist and model. Now, this is completely fabricated by jealousy, as John Singer Sargent was getting all the attention for being the greatest painter in Paris, and Madame Gertrude, Madame X, was getting attention for being the greatest beauty in Paris. The problem was both were American, so they had to get their roll slowed down, if to use that expression, so that just taking them down a few notches, the critics had to find something to scandalize both artist and model. But many years later, it's still considered one of the most beautiful works, and you can see that the artist and model would have quite a friendly relationship. In the hand of John Singer Sargent, this letter addresses Madame X as "Dear Baby" and signs it on the bottom, yours, John S. Sargent. That's on the stationery of a hotel, but the greatest part is the drawing on the top, just the top of the head of Virginie in between the two candles that illuminates the upright piano in the studio of John Singer Sargent, captured in this very affectionate painting that is describing the work in the artist's own words. Both the model and the artist thought of this painting as his greatest work, and they agreed that much. But the mother was still rather bothered by the painting, and patching things over, the artist did not want to offend the reputation of the model or the mother of Virginie. So in creating this painting, where she makes a toast, here John Singer Sargent captures Virginie, arm outstretched, but still focusing on that very pointed nose and chin and lips in the outstretched cheers for a great collaboration between the two. And looking at the detail of those flowers, this really gives you a good sense of just how thick and economical the brushwork is in John Singer Sargent. That pits him with the Impressionists as one of the greatest painters of his day. The Met makes a few comparisons between artists of the time, Carolus Duran, Leon Bonnet, Edouard Manet, the father of Impressionism, and probably the best comparison is the Charles-Alexandre Giron, because there's a woman in profile, but all clearly far more dressed with no décolletage, as they say, the exposed flesh, that Sargent represents Madame X in that low-cut dress. And there's a Whistler painting that's from the same time period, arrangement in black number 5, but again, nothing close to the low-cut V that gives the painting its title, X, or Madame X. And there it is, one of the greatest masterpieces by Sargent. At least he and the model both believe so, but he was not able to sell it. He did a second version, hoping to sell this to Virginie's husband, but he was not interested, and the couple will be divorced a few years later. And hanging on the wall of the official salon, it was not the most scandalous painting. In fact, the most erotic was Bouguereau's Bacchanal on the far right of your screen. Paintings hung from floor to ceiling. What Sargent had going for him is the starkness of his painting that could be seen from 60 yards away. As if it's a simple figure ground, some of the other paintings, smaller and more busy in detail, just simply don't read from a great distance as Sargent's did. By the way, Whistler's painting is just above his, and that's Bouguereau, the leader of the Academy, on the far right. In looking at the last works of the evening, we have Auguste Rodin, a sculptor who you all know was the sculptor of The Gates of Hell and The Thinker, and the fencing master, Arsène Vigent, who's about to spring up, right foot coming right to the edge of the composition, fingers keeping the page, but about to spring up if necessary with his fencing weapon against the back wall. He's a fencing master and instructor and represented as if he's about to pounce on an opponent. The breakfast table, which we saw earlier, not part of the current show, but these two domestic scenes are. The table at night and the birthday party, which has this young fellow's face aglow from the candles in the cake, and then illuminated by a secondary light source, the candles in the overhead light on the upper right of the composition. Monet inside at the wood, his wife, the fate, Monet, Sargent still wanted to come back to Paris and felt that Paris was the most important place to make it as an artist, even though he had left in 1886 for his next studio residence in London. And one of the last works that you'll be confronted with in the exhibition is this self-portrait of Sargent, done right about the time he leaves Paris and starts the next chapter of his life in London. Sargent moved decisively to London in 1886, taking Whistler's old studio at 13 Tite Street in Chelsea, but patronage, which had apparently declined in Paris, was slow to develop in England. His work was regarded as avant-garde and, in Sargent's own words, beastly French, and his reputation for creating a scandal with the Madame X had followed him to London, so patrons were a little bit slow to trust a painting done by John Singer Sargent. That's the Tite Street studio, formerly occupied by Whistler and now occupied by Sargent from 1886 until the year of his death, 100 years ago this year. And that's the outside and the inside of his studio at Tite Street. The next chapter will start something quite new, but bringing the props of the chair and that Chinese charactered silk cloth hanging, which he uses as a backdrop behind Lady Agnew, one of his first major commissions in his London period, which is a subject for another time. But I do want to point out that catty-cornered placement of the woman sitting diagonally in a chair that's also moving diagonally to the right in the foreground of the composition. So wedged in that back corner, that lavender sash creates a very modern appearance. And this was a coming of age portrait of a new aristocrat, a woman who married into the royal family of British and taking a position in Scotland, where you can visit this painting today. And this is the heir to the singer's sewing machine, who also commissioned a work by Sargent in 1889. And Sargent's old friend Paul Helou painted in 1889. He's already established in London, but not too far from Paris, where he visits and hopes to really make it as an artist in both places. He eventually does, and in 1890, he sells this work to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. It wasn't quite a museum yet, but it was purchased by the state and is now in the Musée d'Orsay, an 1980s museum built within a train station in the center of that city. And that's the dancer, Spanish dancer, Carmencita. We saw two of the earlier dancers from the Andalusian subjects, the El Jalejo, and the Spanish dancers from the Hispanic Society collection. So there you have Sargent and Paris, now through August the 3rd. I hope you get a chance to see this superlative exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And other notes or lectures can be found on my website, which I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I think we have a little time for a Q&A at this time. So you can unmute yourselves and ask any questions if I didn't cover anything. So thank you so much for your attention today. When are they able to unmute?
Yep. And if you guys have anything in the chat, you want to write any questions, we can ask Thomas if you write them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask questions.
I have a question about, the three of the Madame X's that he had done there, two of them having the strap laying down. I noticed that she was much heavier in the first one on the left. Did he slim her down for the, to make it more flattering on the final?
You mean from the photograph to the?
You had three, yeah, you had three of them, and you had, the one on the right was the final. The one in the middle was like, I guess, in between, and the one on the left. Both the one in the middle and one on the left had the strap that was falling down. But the one on the left, she looked much heavier. She looked different than she did. Did he want to make her more attractive? In other words, the question is, and did he slim her down so she had a tinier waist? And
so if I'm not mistaken, I think that the slide that you're referring to had a photogravure on the right, the photograph on the left, and the painting in the center, right?
I thought the painting was all the way to the right, the final.
Okay, well, I showed it a lot.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know.
So let me see if I can go back to that one. I don't know if I'm able to bring that one back up again. Here it is. Tell me which one you're talking about.
Not that. The one where she has the strap, this one right here. I'm sorry, you're correct. It was the final was in the middle.
Okay, so on the left, you're looking at a photograph, and there's a little bit of keystoning because I had
okay.
Under glass, and it's not straight on.
Yeah.
Exhibition, the photograph, which was done in the 19th century, and the one on the right is the photogravure, a print made from the photograph on the far left, but the painting was photographed, so both images were taken directly from the painting, and there was
right.
The only distortion is that they're in black and white, both the photograph and the photogravure.
Right. That's the other thing I was going to ask you is when he was working with some of these and we saw it, was he, because I have trouble sometimes when I'm painting and I'm using a black and white photograph, an old photograph, and I have to convert it to color. Was he doing similar things, or no? He just was he was painting her from life.
He painted directly from life, and it was customary for him to work on his the height of his career. He worked about 6 or 7 sessions, 2 hours at a time, never overtaxing the model. So we're talking about 12 to 14 hours in front of the model.
Wow.
So 6 or 7 sessions, and then he did many more, dozens more hours without the model there. So
Yeah.
things that he's painting from life are the necessary things, and then there's a lot to be done, like little details. I didn't point out that crown of Diana,
Right.
her head, which I'm sure he invented. I don't think that Madame X had that head dress, but a little reference that relates her to the goddess of the hunt and
Mhm.
Apollo, giving it a classical element to an otherwise contemporary woman. So those types of things, the table, the background, they could all
Right.
be without the model standing in front of him, and even the cloth and the way she's pulling up her dress to
Mhm.
fit feet down below. So those types of details would have been done without the model, and that
Mhm.
very pale skin, which is caused by a lot of makeup, that's done in front of the model, and trying to capture the light in a very compressed time of the day, which I would assume he would work at the same time of the day with controlled light in his
Mhm.
studio.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and or write it in the chat, and I'll rely
I
on.
just want to say that this is such an excellent lecture. I really enjoyed it. And I wondered if portrait artists today, is John Singer Sargent kind of revered, or everybody has their own style?
Well, personally, I think he's the greatest American portraitist ever. He did go out of fashion for some decades in the 20th century when modernism was preferred. Before the end of his life, he all but gave up portraiture. About 1907, 1908, he was done. He did everything he needed to do and was feeling that he wanted to do other things, as we artists don't necessarily care about money. We prefer to follow our creative instincts. So he was painting landscapes, he was doing watercolors and many other things, but eventually will come back to portraiture when asked to do portraits of Woodrow Wilson, because he was living in London and represented Woodrow Wilson as an ally who entered World War I and fought with the Brits. So giving back to the country of his residence, he did a portrait of Woodrow Wilson in about 1917, 1918. So it's something that I would consider him one of the greatest portraitists, but he did go out of fashion when abstract expressionism and pop art was in vogue. But painters respect him as clearly somebody, regardless of what's in vogue. He was, as far as portraiture is concerned, light years ahead of just mere recorders of likenesses. He turned his sitters into very lush, beautiful masterpieces. And it's because of the way that he handles the paint and places it on like an impressionist that makes his surfaces so seductive to the eye.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, I'll thank you for coming tonight. I believe that Flower Fields records these lectures, so they'll be available in the future. If you missed it, missed any parts, they'll be online at their website in the future. And I hope to see you again soon in the near future. Have a great
Yes,
summer.
that's right. It's going to be on our website because this is recorded, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. which you can access through our website. Thanks, Thomas, for coming, and thank you, everybody, for coming and listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great night and a great summer.
Live.